All right, everyone. Good to see you all for this 13th session of Original Faith Equipped to Proclaim series. And John, I'm very happy to see you here. So we'll just say a short word of prayer, and we will get into the discussion arguments. Here, you can say a word of prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, Lord Jesus, thank you for bringing us here into your presence once again. As we are here in our 13th session of the Reasonable Faith program, Lord Jesus, learning how to equip ourselves with the defenses for our faith, Lord Jesus, so that when it comes for us to share the gospel um, in a more educated manner, Lord Jesus, that we will be able to stand our ground, Lord Jesus, so that we can follow 1 Peter 3 verse 15, Lord Father, so that we may be able to defend our faith with grace, Lord. Thank you for all of us who have come here, Lord Jesus, and please bless Jacob with your divine wisdom, Lord Jesus, so that he'll be able to articulate all the points in such a way that it will be easily understandable by all of us, Lord Jesus, and that we can apply it to our daily lives. Thank you for your wonderful grace, Lord Jesus. In Jesus' name we pray.
So we are at the final argument for the existence of God, the resurrection argument. And this is also the biggest slide that we made today. It has over 40 slide points to go through. So this is the bedrock of Christianity, right? This is where Christianity stands or falls. So what we're going to cover in this argument is we're going to look at the nature of the resurrection argument, what is the style of the argument format. Then we will look at what are the historical facts of the moon landing. Okay? Why are we talking about the moon landing? Okay, we'll see in a minute. And then what are the historical facts about the resurrection? So why did I say that this is the bedrock of Christianity? Well, 1 Corinthians 15. And it's most clearly states that if Christ did not raise, then our faith is useless, our faith is futile, and that we, of all people, are to be pitied. Right? So this is the ramification, this is the implication that the falsehood of the resurrection has for Christianity. If Christ did not rise from the dead, our faith is futile, our preaching is futile, we are in vain, we are still in our sins, and we are the most pitied of people. So that means that all the preaching and everything that we have done, all the meetings that we have done, everything that we do on a Sunday morning, on the ISPF meetings, everything, all of that is absolutely useless. So which is why it concerns us to see when someone asks, why do you think that, how can you say that the resurrection really happened over 2000 years ago? So earlier we've seen the Kalam argument, fine-tuning argument, moral argument. Now Lucas was here through all of this, and we were telling that these are deductive arguments, right? And the difference between a deductive and an inductive argument, like the resurrection is that the deductive argument is airtight. So you have two statements or three statements, and if they are true and if the logic is valid, then the conclusion will follow. There is no way around it. There is no way to escape it. The case with an inductive argument is that you're asking the question, what best fits the data? Right? So you have the data in front of you and you're trying to make sense of the data, which means that it isn't going to be as airtight as a deductive argument. And what we are going to look at is, okay, right, what is the data in front of us? Those would be the historical facts. So we would ask, what are the facts that concern the resurrection? And then are they historical? If that is the case, then we have all the facts in front of us. The next thing that we will ask is, okay, we have all the facts, we have all the details. Now, what about the theories, or what about the hypothesis? What about the explanations? What best explains the data? What best makes sense of the data? And we will look at an example of this inductive argument shortly right now. And so what happens to us is that we have all of these pieces of data in front of us, and we have this explanation or that explanation. But if none of these work, maybe there's a third explanation, or maybe there's a fourth explanation. The issue is we have this collection of explanations, and any person can at any time add one more theory or one more hypothesis or one more explanation to this basket, which means that this is going to be like a game of whack-a-mole. You have different explanations popping up. In the second part of the resurrection argument, we will look at different theories people have posted. One was that Jesus never really died. The other was that Jesus had a twin brother. The other was that the disciples stole Jesus' body. The other was the disciples hallucinated about seeing Jesus. The other was that there was a Roman conspiracy to fake the resurrection of Jesus. Or maybe Jesus really rose from the dead. So what is happening here? You have the facts about the resurrection, and you're trying to make sense of these facts, saying well, maybe the disciples just really hallucinated, right? They think they saw Jesus, maybe they just hallucinated. Or they would say, well, given what Christianity has impacted the world, maybe we'll have to say that the Romans did something to fake the resurrection. So all you're doing is you're trying to make sense of the resurrection. You're trying to make sense of what really happened, and you have very weird and confusing and rather absurd theories each popping up one after the other. And that is why I said it is airtight. There could always be new arguments that come in that leave or try to explain some part of it better than some other argument. And we have to look into it and make choose or make sense of what best explains the data. Let me give you a very quick example, a very simple example of how this inductive argument, how we are inducing what's happening, right? How this inductive argument happens. There are 10 test subjects, right? And we will name them A1, A2, A3, all the way till A10. And the first person, A1, smokes 1 cigarette a day. The second person smokes 2 cigarettes a day. And so on and so forth. And the 10th person smokes 10 cigarettes a day. So how many cigarettes does the fifth person smoke? 5, right? So that's the way we form the situation. So this is the data that we have. There are 10 test subjects. The first person smokes the least. The 10th person smokes the most. And what other data do we have? We also have the health spectrum. So we see that the first person has the best health. The second person has worse of health, and even worse, and even worse. And finally, the 10th person has the worst health. So we have two pieces of data in front of us. We have the data of how much each person smokes, and we have the data of how well their health is doing. So now if we were to explain the data in front of us, if we were to see what makes sense of the data, what theory or explanation or hypothesis, if you may call it, makes sense of the data, let's say we have two explanations. One is that smoking negatively affects your health. The other is that smoking has no effect on your health. Now, you can look at these both data and say the explanation that makes best sense of the data is the first one. Smoking negatively affects your health. Now, someone can come in and say maybe genetics played a role, or maybe it was the eating habit. Right? Those are other areas that has to be explained. Maybe the explanation that smoking negatively affects your health, that theory may not fully explain all the piece of data that we have. We just have two pieces of data. If we add more and more pieces of data, maybe we come to a point where there are these details that this theory doesn't really explain. But of all of the theories, what best makes sense of it? That smoking negatively affects your health. Now, what makes absolutely no sense to say that smoking has no effect on your health. This is how an inductive argument happens. Right? You right now can think about different pieces of information that you can bring in to make this theory less effective or less applicable. That is how it happens with inductive argument. You can keep on adding pieces, you can keep on adding data materials, you can keep on twisting your theories to make it somehow tweak and fit and make sense of the data. Right? Like I said, one theory was that Jesus never really died. So the disciples saw a Jesus who was somewhat half alive and as such. Now, the other way to tweak it was to say that Jesus had a twin brother. So you see someone who looks just like Jesus, but not crucified, there is no mark on his body, and so on and so forth. So you can always tweak different pieces of data or hypothesis to make better sense of it. And the task with us, and task that historians are going to do is, they are looking at what are the facts, the pieces of data about this event of the resurrection. And once we figure out that these are the true historical facts, they ask, if this is the case, then what really makes sense of it? What really happened here? In this part one, we are going to look at what are the facts. Part two, we will look at the explanations of the resurrection. So why did I talk about the moon landing? Well, I want to use an example that we can use to relate to a non-believer. When we are talking about the resurrection, right? The inner witness of the Holy Spirit. If you have never heard of the resurrection argument, the inner witness of the Holy Spirit is valid enough for us to hold with utmost certainty that Christ still lives. Now we are talking about how we can use it to encourage us in our faith, but also to share it with a non-believer. So if you were to share it with a non-believer, you may not have the slide with you, you may not have all the details with you, but what is some example that you can use to connect and make sense to them? How we work through these pieces of information to say that the resurrection is the best explanation. Which way I'm taking the moon landing as one example to carry along across these two sessions. Right? The moon landing is conspiracy embedded, just like the resurrection. There is so much of conspiracy, people still don't believe that moon landing happened, and moon landing has a lot of conspiracy with it. And so we will be able to use a real historical event that happened in recent past to show how conspiracy theories fail, to show how conspiracy theories get really absurd, that when you put all the pieces together, it makes zero sense, or really very little sense to say that the entire moon landing was fake. So when we look at the moon landing, we're not going to dwell much on it, just one more slide. When we look at the moon landing, what are the facts that demand an explanation? What are the pieces of the moon landing history that asks us, okay, how do you make sense of this? Well, you have the images to make sense of. You have the question of the future expeditions. Did they happen afterwards? The last we went to the moon was 1972. I think we went more 5 or 7 times after the initial moon landing. Why did we not go afterwards? That's a question. The question of the human artifacts that is on moon, that human astronauts are said to put there. The question of lunar artifacts, the moon rock, I think about 5 kgs in weight that we have carried back to the Earth. And then the question about the aspect of the mass publicity and involvement of thousands of people being involved in the first moon landing mission. So these are all the facts with regards to the moon landing. So conspiracy theorists would come and say this is fake, people were paid off, and so on and so forth. I have made sense of all the explanations. The person who would say that the moon landing is a historical event would give maybe a better explanation of how all these facts were. The conspiracy theorists would fail to make sense of some detail. So in this way, once we complete both parts, and I hope you will be there for the second part as well, we will see how we can use a real world example to show how conspiracy theories fail to make sense of something in the history. Now, moon landing is quite recent in history to us, and we have at least pictures to talk about. That is not the case with the resurrection. The resurrection is much more complex, but it gives us an idea about how this argument style structures so far. So I hope this much is clear, and we're going to move now into the resurrection facts. What are the facts, historical facts that comes from the resurrection? The style that I'm going to take it, there are multiple ways to do this. What I'm going to go for is one of my favorite ways to argue for it, which is called the minimal facts approach. Meaning you're going to use a very minimum number of facts to argue for it. And these are facts that have almost unanimous consensus from scholars when it comes to the details that we're going to use. Scholars, Christian scholars, non-Christian scholars, atheist scholars, agnostic, you name it, there's a consensus on these facts. And there are multiple ways to do it. And I mentioned this in case if someone wants to probe it further. We've seen on other instances, especially on Clubhouse, where people have mixed up what are the different types of arguments and have tried to counter it, seeming they've done a great job. They've actually misunderstood what's happening here. So the format we're going to look through is Dr. William Lane Craig's version. We're going to look at 3 simple facts, right? 3 simple historical facts about the resurrection, and we're going to ask what explains these 3 facts. Now, there is a version by Gary Habermas, a renowned historical scholar on the resurrection. He has about 6 or more facts. Now, there is another version where you can include even more details when you're presenting the case for the resurrection, where you show bit by bit that the Gospels are reliable, and then from there you will build on to the reliability of the resurrection. That is the maximal facts. You're bringing as much as facts or details into the fold. The minimal facts, by contrast, tries to use as little facts as possible. To me, I think it's just a matter of what to use in which context. That's the word. How much time that you have to go through, and so on and so forth. And one difference for you to make sense of why scholars take these 2 different approaches, that when you look at the maximal facts approach, one of the first point mentioned is that that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, meaning that Jesus' burial is a historical event. When you come to the minimal facts approach, we start off talking by the empty tomb. And when we talk about empty tomb, there we would mention the historicity of the burial. So you see how the number of facts, there is a variation. It's not that you're throwing away those details, it's that you're presenting them in a much more compact way. And you're reducing it just to 3 specifically mentioned details. That's the difference. Now, I mentioned this for the sake of those who want to probe and learn more about the resurrection further to make sure that you don't get a confusion that they are opposed to each other or anything of that sort. So, what are the 3 facts that we're going to test the historicity of when it comes to the resurrection? One is the empty tomb, the appearance of Christ, the post-mortem, after death appearance of Christ to the disciples, and then the question of the origin of Christianity. How did Christianity come to form in the first place? 3 facts: empty tomb, appearance of Christ, and the origin of Christianity. So let's look at the empty tomb and see how can we build a case for the historicity of the burial. So when you talk about the empty tomb, you have to talk about Jesus' burial process. The burial is mentioned in Mark, Acts, and 1 Corinthians. So in 1 Corinthians 15, in the passage that we just read as well, Paul talks about Christ was delivered and he was buried and he rose as per scriptures fulfilled. When this creed, this by heart creed that Paul is dictating to the church, atheist, agnostic, non-Christian scholars like Bart Ehrman themselves have said that this creed was formed within 3 to 5 years after Christ's resurrection, or as he would say, alleged resurrection. Meaning that within 3 to 5 years of this event that has happened, the creed was formed, sharing to everyone that Christ rose again from the dead and he appeared himself to Peter, the disciples, 500, and the last to Paul. Which means that there wasn't even enough time, according to historians, to the historical standard that we use, to say that there was enough time for a legend to form. It takes a couple of years, at least a generation, for a legend, a myth to form. We're talking about 3 to 5 years, which is way too short for any legend to form. That is the first detail. The other is known as the Jerusalem factor, meaning Christ's public life happened in Jerusalem. Christ's very public death happened in Jerusalem. And Christ's burial also happened in Jerusalem. The tomb of Christ was not parked away in some corner of the world where no one could really go out and figure out whether his body is still there or not. The people were left to just speculate. Now, his body was there in the city of Jerusalem. His burial happened in the city of Jerusalem, meaning it was always within an arm's length distance for his believers, non-believers, to the Romans to show, if they wanted to show, that Christ's body is still there in the tomb. This is known as the Jerusalem factor. And the third detail is Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin that condemned Christ to death. Now the question is he historical? And scholars are almost unanimous when they look at this and they say there is no reason that Christians would create a character of the Sanhedrin, the very Sanhedrin that convicted Jesus to crucifixion. There is no sense for them to build up a character as such. It's much more easy to say that Peter and John went and buried Jesus. There is no sense in any way to say that Joseph of Arimathea, this fake character, was built up as part of the Sanhedrin, who came and buried Jesus, that his very council set forth crucifixion. These details point together, and there are other details, I'm just bringing them very short. These details point to the fact that Christ's burial was historic. And this is why John A.T. Roberts of Cambridge University says that the burial of Jesus is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. So he was in fact buried. That is a piece of history. He was in fact buried. Now, with the empty tomb, the second way to argue for the empty tomb is there are multiple independent sources claiming that there is an empty tomb. And we have the 4 Gospels, Acts, and 1 Corinthians 15. Now, one thing to know about historically figuring out details, like when we talk about who Alexander was, or what he did, or what he said, when we talk about Plato, Aristotle, when we talk about the lives of Caesar, and the crossing of Rubicon, when we talk about all these historical events, one way that historians try to figure out whether something is historical or not is on the basis of how many independent data or how many independent writings mention it. So if it's just one mention of the event, they are not that convinced of it. But if there are 2 independent, not the same source, 2 independent sources mentioning that this thing happened, then historians are quite certain that this is actually a piece of history, right? Because it's 2 separate people recording it. And it's much more sensible to say that this is actually part of history than to say that 2 sources came together and made this stuff up. What we see with the empty tomb is that there is at least 6 independent sources telling that the tomb of Christ was empty, which is way more than the minimum standard that critical, academical, historical scholars demand. This is another reason for us to say that the tomb was empty. The idea of resurrection, right? The Jews and the pagans both had an idea about a physical resurrection of Christ. The Jews held that the resurrection would happen at the very end, and they didn't think that the Messiah had to be resurrected. But nonetheless, the Jews and pagans both had an idea about resurrection. And also interesting is that when in Peter, in Acts 2 verse 29, when he talks about the tomb of David, he says this, the tomb of David is there right here in Jerusalem, but the tomb of Christ is empty. The body of David, the tomb is right there, but the tomb of Christ is empty. Meaning, Peter was very explicitly telling that the resurrection that we preach is a bodily, physical resurrection. We're not talking about a spiritual resurrection. We're not talking about some sort of modern day conception about resurrection where you could argue and say the body was there, but his spirit rose up. No. We're talking that his tomb is literally empty. That the body of Jesus that you crucified on the cross is not there in the tomb. And scholars point out saying that to the Palestinian Christians of that time, to somehow make a difference between a resurrection and then a spiritual resurrection is like speaking about a square circle. When they preached about the resurrection, the Jews and the pagans understood that to be a physical bodily resurrection. So it was quite absurd for the Jews. Let's say when it talks about the cross and the resurrection, so it talks about how the Jews and the pagans found very difficult to grasp it. They were saying, "Are you saying that this dead man literally came back to life? Not that his spirit was floating around or anything, that he actually came back to life?" The reason is both the pagans and the Jews understood that the resurrection was physical, which means that when the disciples were going and talking about the empty tomb, they were actually talking about an empty tomb. That is another piece of data from the testimony of the disciples, from the historical record, that shows that the tomb was in fact empty. You couldn't argue for a spiritual resurrection. The most stunning piece of all, the woman witness for the tomb. Right? In the Jewish context at that time, first century Judea, the testimony of woman was not admitted in court. I'm not talking about testimony about supernatural events. We're talking about testimony about normal events. Testimony of woman was not admitted in court. And even women were unfit to hold the law. That's why Sotah says, sooner let the words of the law be burned than delivered to woman. Which means it is better for the thought of the law to be burned than for it to be delivered to a woman. How ironic is it that the Lord of the covenant and the fulfillment of the law that happened at the resurrection was delivered first to the woman. And this piece of woman witness is so important because the disciples are coming and telling something quite radical. Okay? They're not saying that Jesus, he was sleeping and he woke up and he went out for a walk. They're saying that the Jesus whom you saw crucified on the cross, whom the Romans clinically assassinated on the cross, made sure he was dead, brought down, has been 3 days, has come back alive. Not that the Jesus will resurrect at the end. That's what the Jews assume, that the resurrection will happen at the end. Everyone will resurrect in their body. They said that his resurrection has happened right now and he is the Messiah. They're making a very radical claim. What sense is it for them to say that the first people to encounter the risen Lord, the first proof of the resurrection, was delivered by women whose testimony on even normal, common facts was not admitted in court? If you were making the resurrection, the last thing you want to do is to say that the least qualified people to make a statement hold in court made this most radical, unbelievable statement. This piece of detail even leaves skeptics wondering how to make sense of this fact. Why on earth would the disciples say that women whose testimony was not admitted in court, not even in normal day-to-day events, that they were the people who were proclaiming these most radical of all claims to the people out there? They could have said Peter and John and so on. No, they said that the woman came, told the disciples, they didn't believe, and then the disciples believed. So the women were believed much more than the men. It's even more radical to make all of that claim. So if you don't remember any points about the empty tomb, keep this detail in mind, because it is quite unbelievably hard for anyone to navigate their way out of this argument. The fact that the woman witness points most inexcusably towards the empty tomb. And finally, a very interesting piece. Jews accepted that the tomb was empty. Right? What is happening here? In Matthew 28, Matthew talks about what is happening behind the scenes. Right? And this is connected because scholars want to sometimes say that the guard who was in charge of the soldiers in guard of the tomb was something that Matthew created up. Right? And they also say that Matthew was creating this to somehow defend the resurrection. So let's consider what's happening here. Right? Let's say Matthew wants to fake the resurrection and he wants to add on fake details for the resurrection. So Matthew says, the disciples proclaim Christ has resurrected. And the Jews say, no, the disciples stole the body. So when the Jews say this, Matthew would, let's assume, he's making up details, he's faking the resurrection. Matthew would come up and say, no, there were guards at the tomb. So why is Matthew making up this detail? To counter the statement that the disciples stole the body. So when they say the disciples stole the body, Matthew is making up the detail, there was a guard, so they cannot steal the body. If Matthew was faking the resurrection, if he was faking the whole thing about the empty tomb, he was faking all of this, he should stop there. He should mention in Matthew, and there was a guard guarding the tomb, and he should move on. But what does Matthew do in this passage? He mentions that when the disciples said that they were guards, what is the response from the Jewish leaders? What is the response from the Jewish public? That the soldiers were bribed, that the soldiers slept off. Right? It says, tell the disciples came by night and stole him while we were asleep. So when Matthew says, when the disciples say, Jesus arose, the Jewish response is, the disciples stole the body. So Matthew says, there was a guard at the tomb. And the soldiers say, they were asleep, and the Jews say that the soldiers slept off. And then Matthew says that they were bribed. There is no reason for Matthew to mention about the bribery of the soldiers unless and until the Jews say that the soldiers slept. Which means that when the Jewish leaders and the Jewish public and Matthew, when he's mentioned this one small detail about the sleeping of the soldiers, he is revealing the fact that the Jewish public understood that the tomb was empty. If the tomb wasn't empty, there was no reason for them to tell about sleeping guards. There is no reason for Matthew to make up the bribery part. He should just say there was a guard and leave the story there. By Matthew mentioning this one minuscule normal detail, it is revealing a whole lot fact that the Jewish public understood that the tomb is empty. And so the sleeping guards part can only be explained as something that the Jews themselves put forward. It doesn't make any sense for Matthew to say. So by putting all of this together for the empty tomb, what do we see? It says that the reliability of the biblical statements hold firmly. These are by historical scholars on the reliability. Van Helm says that it's extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb. And when people object, it's purely on theological or philosophical assumptions. When you don't want miracles to be there, when you don't want a risen Messiah, when you don't want Christianity to be true, those theological reasons push you to say that the tomb was not empty. Which is why I said initially that the almost 75%, actually the 75% of consensus of scholars is that the tomb was in fact empty. Third detail, we're going to speed up a bit and go through this. The third detail is the appearance of Jesus. Okay? Did Jesus really appear to the disciples? First proof is Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, and he mentions about these people to whom there were appearances. And he also and these are also corroborated, these are also substantiated in other passages, right? Appearance to Peter, Paul mentions Luke 24. Appearance to the 12, Paul, Luke 24, John 20. And appearance to the 500, Paul mentions that there are live witnesses. Scholar C.H. says that the only reason Paul is mentioning this 500 detail number is saying that there are these witnesses right there in front of you. You can ask them the question. And then finally, appearance to James and to Paul. So when we ask the question, do we have any reason to say that there was appearance of Jesus to the disciples, whatever the nature be? Maybe hallucination, whatnot. We're just asking, did the disciples have some sort of an experience of appearance of Jesus to them? The first reason that historians would point out is that we have this list in 1 Corinthians 15 that a historical document is making that has been substantiated by other documents. We mentioned independent attestation, independent documents all saying the same detail, same principle is in play here. And that comes to effect even more when we look at there are even more details mentioning about the people to whom there were appearance of Jesus. Now, even at this stage, if you're wondering, but really, how do we come to conclude that the disciples had some sort of an experience of Jesus? Isn't this too far back in history? Even if you look at these records and details, they could still make this stuff up, or could still simply write 500 people and move on. The very stark observation about the historical engagement of Christianity is that even atheist scholars, like even scholars who are the most repulsive to Christianity, there is a seminar called Jesus Seminar. It is not a seminar made of Christians. It is a seminar, it is a group of non-Christian hardcore atheists who come together to cross-examine Christianity. Gerd Ludemann is a member of this Jesus Seminar. Most famous skeptic, one of the most famous skeptics. Listen to what he says. It can be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experience after Jesus' death, in which Jesus appeared to them as a risen Christ. Here is a statement by one of the most renowned atheists, a part of the Jesus Seminar that is set about on the mission to disprove Christianity, admitting a statement that we should only expect Christians to say. They say that as a historian, when you look at all of these pieces of data about the appearance of Jesus, it is historically certain that the disciples had an experience of the risen Lord. That is an unbelievable admission for a non-Christian to make, because it is quite easy for us to dismiss it as it never happened and Paul made up these details and made up this list. But for a non-Christian to come and admit that it is historically certain that this happened, it shows how overwhelming the evidence is to a trained scholar and a historian. These may be far beyond our field, but this shows where rigorous academic world stands at. And the final piece of data about the appearance is that, again, the disciples always taught, the Gospels always mentioned that the appearance was a physical bodily appearance. So when we talked about the empty tomb, we saw different lines of evidence telling us the tomb was in fact empty. When we talk about the appearance of Jesus, we have the list of all the people Paul mentions and the consensus from, again, the appearance of Jesus is more than 75% of historical scholars who look at it hold that the disciples had an experience of Christ. Lee Strobel, in his book, when he was investigating the research, and in his movie, The Case for Christ itself, that he interviews one of the leading psychologists of America. She says that to say that 500 people had a hallucination would be a far greater miracle than the resurrection itself. Because that is, and again, the statement is not made by a Christian to try and to put the resurrection on a pedestal. It's made by an atheist saying that, to say that all of these appearances are absolute fabrications is much more radical than the resurrection itself. And then finally, the disciples all taught that the experience that they had was physical bodily resurrection. That is what they always taught. That is what they always preached. And so this piece of information would come into play when we try and make sense of what type of appearance was it. Or did they really have an appearance, or did they hallucinate, and so on and so forth. So the two pieces we have covered, MD2 and the appearance of Jesus. I mean, in case if you want to take a picture of this quote and keep it handy, you can do by all means. But we'll be sharing we have already shared the PPT to the Google Drive, so you can access it from there anytime. The final point, the origin of Christianity. What is happening here? The disciples are former Jews, no doubt about that. Christ himself was a Jew. The disciples are former Jews. And contrary to the expectations of the Jews, that this guy who is feeding 5,000, this guy who is exorcising demons, who is doing wonders, miracles, that he would come and deliver the nation of Israel from the captivity of a foreign regime. This Savior, this Messiah has completely failed. He is captured by the rulers and is crucified by the captors themselves. And so, contrary to Jewish expectations of who a Messiah is, the disciples are coming and saying, this Messiah, whom you put up for crucifixion, whom the Romans crucified by getting hung on a tree, which is a curse above everything else, whom the Lord did not deliver on the cross, he is still the Messiah. That does not fit at all anything with any Jews expect of a Messiah. So, what is the reason for the disciples who are former Jews within a Judaic context to come and say this crucified, failed person is the real Messiah? And you may hear about people saying that there is Horus and Osirion and was one more third century mythical figure. No, not Gilgamesh. If I recall it, I'll mention it. You may hear from atheists who mention that, oh, you have these rising and dying gods, right? These were not common within the Jewish context. And then again, when you look at the original sources, it nowhere says that Osiris or Horus or anyone died and came back to life in 3 days or anything of sort. Mitra, yeah, the god of Mitra. Even Mitra doesn't have a death and resurrection within 3 days or anything of that sort. These are all unbelievably utter fabrications of historical records. So you don't have any context for the Jewish believers to come up and say that the failed Messiah, whom Yahweh was supposed to send, who came and said that he will destroy the temple and rebuild within 3 days, who did all of this stuff, was captured and killed, came back to life. How do you explain this origin of Christianity? And look at the transformation of James and Paul, right? The martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of John, is unanimously held across scholarship as that they were actually martyred for their belief in Christ. So Sean McDowell's PhD thesis, The Fate of the Apostles, he puts these 4 deaths as of most historical certainty. But others, we don't have as many data to pull it together as historically certain. But these 4 data pieces are historically certain. Peter, Paul, James, and John, and the other James, where both the James, Peter, and Paul were martyred for the faith in Christ. And then think, we're talking about Paul and James. James, we know from history, was not a believer of Christ initially. And then later, he became an elder of the church and he was crucified and he was martyred for his faith. Paul, and this is again a stark admission by non-Christian scholars when they say that Paul, who was a pursuit of Christianity, had a radical encounter on his way to Damascus. And later, this persecutor of Christianity became a follower of Christ. Not Christian scholars saying it, atheist scholars saying it. Scholars who do not have any predisposition to give any leeway for the resurrection, coming and making the admission that the greatest preacher of Christianity after Christ possibly was earlier a persecutor, but now a Christian. What makes sense of what happened to Paul? And we also see that this transformation of James and Paul happens to all of the disciples. That the Gospels record that these disciples lacked faith, they were weak, they were timid, but after 3 days, these guys who do not have a physical Jesus to show around, consider this, they don't have a physical Jesus to show around. Jesus isn't going around making physical appearance to the high priest or Pilate or anyone. They don't have a physical Jesus to show around. Yet they are courageously proclaiming till the very end of their life that he rose and came back to life. What could have transformed and radicalized their life? These are the 3 pieces of data that history presents to us. His tomb was empty. His disciples had an experience of Christ, and that Christianity had an unbelievably radical origin in the context of a hostile environment where Christianity should not have originated. And you look at every person's reflection on this, they say that how have they turned almost overnight into indomitable band of enthusiasts He braved opposition, cynicism, ridicule, hardship, prison, and death in three continents as they preached everywhere Jesus and the resurrection. What could have changed their hearts? Alan Mattingly of the University says that the apostles Saint Peter and Saint Paul sealed their witness with their blood. That was their final verdict that what we preach is what we know, Christ crucified. And famous historian Philip Shaw says that the conversion of Paul marks not only a turning point in personal history, but also an important epoch in the history of the Apostolic Church and consequently in the history of mankind. It was the most fruitful event since the miracle of Pentecost and secured the universal victory of Christianity. These are all reflection of what scholars and historians have looked at the records of Paul and the life of Paul and have come to the conclusion that this radical persecutor of Christianity became a propagator of Christianity. And there are so many quotes to mention, but I just picked some to convey the point. Lord George Littleton, when he started off, he and his friend came together to write a book to disprove the resurrection. But within the first chapter, he changed his track, accepted the resurrection, and wrote a book in the defense of the resurrection. And he says, the conversion and apostleship of Saint Paul alone, duly considered, was of itself a demonstration sufficient to prove Christianity to be a divine revelation. This is what we're standing on with. So the form of the resurrection, the three facts: the empty tomb, appearance of Jesus, and the origin of Christianity. The question that historians still grapple with, the question that still faces us is, what do we make sense of the data? We have these pieces of history, this is what we gleaned, this is what history tells us is in fact the reality. Now we ask, what makes best sense of it? Do we say that disciples, all of them, and even the 500 of them, had hallucinations? Well, does that explain the empty tomb? Well, no, it doesn't. Do we say that disciples lied? Well, then what happened to the body? What happened to the origin of Christianity? What motivation did they have to go out and lie? Do we say that Jesus had a twin brother? What historical basis do we have to say that he even had a twin brother? Do we say that Jesus was not really dead? How can we counter the historical fact that Jesus was buried dead? As we saw in one of the early ones, one of the best attested fact that he was buried. How can we attest that fact and what we know about the crucifixion to say that Jesus never really died? When we look at all of these theories in the next session, to try and bring together them in congruence with the data, we see that all of them fail to make best sense of the data apart from one explanation that we know and hold to be true in our heart. Christ rose from the dead on the third day. And that's it. We have come to the end of this session on the introductory part of the resurrection argument. I'm just going to go and stop sharing.